So I'm going to, hi. I'm going to speak from up here because I want to be able to see my slides while I'm talking, and I don't have an option to do that unless I speak from the podium. So first of all, I just want to say thank you so much for having me, and I'm really looking forward to feedback on this. Oops, I'm going to forward with this. So from its inception, nuclear strategy has been a profoundly ahistorical field. And only recently, scholars have begun to exploit the wealth of evidentiary knowledge generated during the Cold War, whether that's in the form of diplomatic history or creating data sets against which to test rational choice models. Mining that data has revolutionary potential because providing an evidentiary basis against which to assess theories of nuclear deterrence and nonproliferation holds out the possibility not only of reinvigorating a stale intellectual debate, but of fundamentally reconfiguring what we believe to be true about nuclear deterrence and nonproliferation and how it operates. So, as scholars close the gap between the theory and the practice, what worked about Cold War era nuclear strategy and policy, and more importantly perhaps why it worked, are likely to be replaced with updated ideas that take into account connections that cannot be discovered through deductive analysis alone. And so I'm thinking here of a couple of different literatures that are all emergent right now. One is this nuclear history project and books like Frank Gavin's Nuclear Statecraft, which reveals how the larger context of U.S. economic policy towards NATO shaped nuclear nonproliferation policies in ways that theories of why states build nuclear weapons don't capture. Another direction is the statistical tests performed by people like Matt Koenig and Matt Furman, the conclusions of which fly in the face of much of the received wisdom about the peaceful pursuit of nuclear energy. There are also another literature that I would say Gabrielle Hecht would be exemplary of, but also Eric Schlosser's Command and Control. These are stories of accidents, near misses, and uncounted costs that were intentionally or unintentionally occluded during the Cold War. So things that the dominant narrative of deterrence required be left out of the conversation in order to justify the kind of costless appearance of nuclear weapons. So at the same time, by tethering theories of nuclear deterrence and nonproliferation to the weight of the past, the same data could prove to be a conservative force. Insofar as beliefs about what is possible are assessed with respect to what's happened before, the history of the nuclear age has the potential to limit thinking about the future of nuclear policy, and in particular, the thinking about nuclear deterrence. So the big question that this project is designed to get some purchase on is, in the absence of a kind of irreconcilable break with the past, such as of yet unforeseen socio-technical development, something we haven't imagined yet, or the kind of establishment of a world state that Campbell talks about, it's hard to imagine what might displace the power of nuclear weapons. So how do we grab hold of the revolutionary potential of the knowledge now available to us without becoming imprisoned within the boundaries of the past? And this question is really salient with respect to the future of nuclear disarmament, because insofar as this moment where all of this data is becoming available is guided by the same deductive models and conceptual frameworks that dominated the academic study of nuclear issues during the Cold War, the data is likely to be then read into the discourse through similar lenses, right? You're going to occlude the same sorts of problems and bring others to bear. And in particular here, the problem that I'm thinking about is the fact that there is a lot of alternative framing work being done around the notion of collecting and looking at different issues, you know, Joe Masco, Gabrielle Hecht, but a lot of that isn't brought to bear on the policy debate at all. Right? It's almost a sense of you can't get there from here. The structure of the policy debate prevents a lot of that from entering the discourse. So part of what this paper is doing is trying to break through and make that connection. So what I argue is that part of the effectiveness of this will be in finding a way to increase the power of the vision of the disarmed future. right? The more powerful that vision, the more likely we are to recognize its connections to our present and read it retrospectively into the past. Despite the recent renaissance in nuclear disarmament and all of the excellent work that's been done on the technical and political aspects of nuclear abolition, the current visions are relatively weak, and as President Obama warned in Prague, may not be attained in our lifetime. Their plans for the future, the realization of which is contingent upon a fundamental shift or political realignment, and therefore remains indefinitely out of reach. Now, when I talk about nuclear disarmament in this context, in the context of this paper, I'm drawing heavily on the World Free of Nuclear Weapons campaign, the campaign that's associated with the Four Horsemen and the Nuclear Security Project. And that campaign, I would say, is radically different in its implicit ontology, underlying theoretical structures, and direction than something like Global Zero. And so I want to distinguish those two because they tend to be conflated frequently. And I actually think that they come from very different intellectual traditions. It's just that the people who work on these things think that intellectual traditions don't matter. And so therefore, they don't bring those into being or actually look at what those distinctions are. But those two communities are very much at odds with one another politically. Global Zero and World Free of Nuclear Weapons are different institutions. And even though there's some crossover, the main principal actors in them argue at great length, and there's a lot of animosity. So I have this picture up because in the World Free of Nuclear Weapons discourse, the Four Horsemen are fond, and the Four Horsemen are George Shultz, Henry Kissinger, Sam Nunn, and Bill Perry, talk frequently about the idea of the vision of nuclear disarmament as being the top of a very tall mountain that's obscured. We can't see what the summit looks like, but we have to keep going, right? So insofar as there is a vision, this is the metaphor that they're using for what that would look like. So it's the question I'm addressing. I want to argue that the picture we should be thinking of would look more like this, right? We can get there, we just have to make some sort of leap. And we need to know, though, where we're landing. It needs to actually become somehow, the idea of where we're landing needs to become something that we can see. So I'm going to start out and just talk a little bit. The presentation, in the paper, I go into depth about the Iran nuclear debate between the realists. And I talk a little bit about the limits of that debate. I'm not going to talk about that here for us now because I think it's less crucial to the overall structure of the argument and the feedback that I'd like to get from all of you. And I'm going to go straight to talking a little bit about what I think are the main blockages in the debate at the theoretical level, like how the blockage, why it is we can't see that vision. And then I'm going to talk about the Iran nuclear case. And the reason I'm going to talk about that is because I think that the blockage in the way the debate is happening around Iran and the sort of limitations of realist scholars to actually really engage with and deal with the problematics of what are going on in terms of the negotiations come from and stem from the same blockage that doesn't allow them to talk about or think about what nuclear disarmament might look like. And so the idea is that by removing that blockage, you open up the possibility both to explain cases like Iran that are happening today, and by being able to explain what's going on today, it gives you more confidence in the idea that these kinds of things can be successful in the future. So the first thing that is important to understand about deterrence is that we typically think of deterrence as deterrence by punishment. This is our idea of nuclear deterrence. So the prevention of action by the existence of a credible threat of unacceptable counteraction. However, early on in the debate, Glenn Snyder introduces the concept of deterrence by denial. Like, he distinguishes deterrence by punishment from deterrence by denial. Deterrence by denial is the belief that the cost of action outweighs the perceived benefits. And this is very much a sort of distinction between offensive and defensive capabilities, right? And he's reading this into the deterrence debate. What I want to argue is that by rethinking the way that realism considers power and thinks about the ontology of power, you can actually start to think about deterrence in a slightly different way. Instead, deterrence becomes a system of interaction through which states trade on technologies of violence in order to achieve outcomes not achievable through the application of violence alone. And this is a kind of Schelling-esque interpretation, but the idea is that the goal of deterrence is not simply to stop action, but it's actually it's a qualitative process of conversion, where you actually create a new and bring into being a new technopolitical space of political action where disputes get hashed out on their own terms. So the argument in this paper is focusing really more on the deterrence moment, as in it's focusing also less in some ways on the act of trade that happens in the context of negotiations, but more on this idea that Iran is actually already functioning as a nuclear weapon state in important ways, that they have constructed a recessed nuclear deterrence by pushing the threat. The threat of retaliation always exists in the future. Iran has just pushed it much further into the future than any other state has ever effectively done. And it's done this by using this combination of the idea of deterrence by punishment in the background and deterrence by denial in the foreground. And so this is just illustrating this concept of the idea that the blockage opens up both cases. So the jumping off point for interacting with the literature on classical realism and critical theory is Campbell's book, The Glimmer of the New Leviathan, in which he asks, I'm not quoting here, I'm paraphrasing, this is my interpretation. Why and how is it that a technology which shook the foundations of strategic thought came to be merely another feature of international politics? And the answer he provides to this is that neorealism does not, as Waltz maintained, merely describe the objective conditions of international politics. It also functions as a normative claim about what Waltz wants and needs to be true. You have to believe that deterrence works, right? And I think that this assessment of neorealism is absolutely correct, and that what it does is it smuggles in a certain normative, like at the ontological level, it's smuggling in a normative assumption about the value of nuclear weapons that doesn't get discussed explicitly. So perhaps the question that is really important for understanding how that happens is less about nuclear weapons per se and more about deterrence, right? So why is it that Waltz is able to reconcile balance of power politics with the theory of nuclear deterrence, whereas many of his contemporaries, most notably Morgenthau, conclude otherwise, right? So the problem becomes less one of reconciling nuclear weapons, but more this puzzle of, well, if Campbell's right that the problem is that Waltz relies too heavily on deterrence, well, why is it that Morgenthau rejects deterrence and Waltz doesn't? So this slide will be familiar to many of you, right? There's a larger structure within this claim about a number of different shifts that occur between neorealism and classical realism with respect to the concept of power. I mean, the first and most important is that Waltz claims that states seek survival rather than international politics being a struggle for power, right? So for Morgenthau, power is an end. What removing it from power from the idea that this is the end that states seek, that opens up the possibility that for Waltz, power becomes a means rather than an end. Waltz also argued that power can be measured in terms of material capabilities, whereas Morgenthau has a very open ontology, right? There are many means that states use to struggle for power. And even though there's this idea of the ultimate ratio being military violence, he doesn't actually think that that is necessarily the only or most important on the sort of day-to-day politics, right? There's a lot more space for diplomatic practice within Morgenthau's ontology of power. And this enables Waltz to argue that nuclear deterrence will and can work as long as countries maintain a secure strike capability, where Morgenthau disagrees with that conclusion. Perhaps most importantly, however, is that Waltz fundamentally redefines what power is. So for Morgenthau, he argues that power is about control of men over men. And power for Morgenthau is an effect. It's the action that you produce. Whereas Waltz has a very long discussion of how that's a mistake. And there are all sorts of ways that this is bound up in larger conversations about power that are happening in the political science discipline at the time, that are happening around the idea of being able to accurately suss out cause and effect relationships. So Waltz is both bringing his theory of international politics into alignment with larger trends within the discipline, but importantly, by saying that power is not about the effect you produce, but rather about the affect, he also is mimicking this distinction between deterrence and compellence. And in a theory of international politics, where Waltz does all this work, he talks explicitly about shelling, and he talks explicitly about how this distinction applies to thinking through America's participation in the Vietnam War, for instance, right? So I argue that this affect-effect distinction, and power simply being the ability to affect others more than they affect you, versus this idea of controlling their effect, maps onto the distinction and brings Waltz's theory, and in particular his ontology of power, into alignment with what is already being assumed to be true in the background of deterrence theory. Because if you read deterrence theorists, the word power is largely absent from a lot of their analysis. So as I've argued elsewhere, nuclear weapons within this framework begin to work as a kind of reification of power. So power becomes, in effect, reified in the form of nuclear weapons, in the form of instruments of violence. This doesn't mean that it's a mistake to think that this definition is that then someone like Waltz says that that there aren't other elements that contribute to the ability to mobilize force on an international scale. Like, Waltz is very careful not to make that mistake. But at the ontological level, power starts to function as if it's this sort of reified commodity. There's a lot of discussion and arguments going on at that time. Morgenthau's contending you can't treat power simply as if it were like money. And Waltz is treating power simply as if it were like money. And elsewhere I argue that nuclear weapons actually do become fetishized in this way in practice. And so this is sort of taking a piece out of that larger argument and saying, well, look, this is how this is happening in theory. And this is also in some way capturing an aspect of the experience of what's happening in practice. And so this is just a quotation to describe what I mean by that dynamic, because I don't trust myself to say it out loud independently. A fetish object always simultaneously completes and confounds the logic of its production, thus producing a contradiction. So in the case of nuclear weapons, the field of military security requires the pursuit of ever more destructive weapons to achieve military victory in war. Yet that pursuit results in the production of nuclear warheads loaded on intercontinental ballistic missiles that have the perverse effect of making war so destructive that they cannot be said to produce security in a conventional sense. So at the same time that nuclear weapons embody the logic of power that as being synonymous with an ever greater capacity for destruction, they at the same time confound the field of national security for which they're being produced. So the argument is that by becoming aware of how the underlying ontology of power shifts in response to the problem of how to incorporate nuclear weapons into realist thought. You bring into being a vision of this sort of fetishized notion of how nuclear weapons operate. And the goal of this is not a deconstructive act in the meaning of deconstructing the fetish, right? The goal is not to then make the fetish go away. The goal is to become aware of the existence of the fetish so that you can manipulate it to your own ends, right? So in other words, you have to become aware of the box that you're trapped in if you want to be able to then manipulate what's going on inside the box in order to find your way out. Arguably, this is what Iran is doing. Iran is sitting on the outside looking at the US behavior, thinking, boy, you know, on some level, they're really trapped inside their own construct, right? And they can manipulate that and use it to the advantage, right? The Iranian diplomats who are doing the negotiations are all American trained, right? Or at least some of them are UK trained, but they're all very well versed in American thinking about things like nuclear strategy and policy. And yet, they come from a culture in which one of the primary purposes of their nuclear security strategy in Iran is simply to resist the co-optation by the West and resist the reading of US concepts into their own practices. So arguably, they are manipulating these concepts in order to create a recessed nuclear deterrent. But their nuclear deterrent, nuclear weapons and the mobilization of military violence only constitute a couple of pillars of this larger strategy. So President Rouhani, when he came into power, explicitly laid out 5 elements of the strategy. And I've organized them here more or less in terms of these categories of the idea that they're both trying to increase the costs and reduce the benefits of strikes against Iranian nuclear facilities. So in other words, deter US and Israeli military aggression. So first, deterring threats against the country. Most of these are deterrents by deterrents like the current, what they mobilize in terms of current deterrents by punishment are asymmetric resources. So one of the things that they very much want, and one of the very first things that they got once they signed the Joint Plan of Action in April, which was designed to lead to the ultimate nuclear agreement, were additional anti-aircraft missiles. Another way in which they're increasing their asymmetric threats is through cyber attacks. Also, Hamas and terrorism in the region. And perhaps this gets a lot of attention. The US context is blocking the Strait of Hormuz. They have the capability of dropping mines in order to close that off. So second, preserving the existing nuclear facilities. This they've done in 2 ways. One is by moving the baseline of negotiations, so they want to be able to hold on to whatever they have. But they also have located them very strategically. And I'm just going to run through this really quickly. This is the nuclear fuel cycle. There's 2 pathways to the bomb, and there's 2 choke points in that pathway. There's 2 things that are extraordinarily difficult to do, but you have to be able to do them in order to produce a nuclear weapon. You either have to be able to enrich uranium, or you have to have a reactor. In particular, the best kind of reactor to have in this regard is a heavy water reactor, because heavy water reactors don't actually require enriched uranium to feed them. Iran has built both of these kinds of facilities, right? This is a map of these facilities. I'm pointing at the wrong thing. I should be pointing over here. So for instance, Fordow has been the main point of contention because at Fordow, Iran located a uranium enrichment facility under a mountain. This is what a uranium enrichment facility looks like. The significance of this kind of facility is partly that it doesn't need a lot of air or outside. It can be self-contained underground, and it has very few signatures. It just needs air vents in order to function. I took out, so I don't have the picture of the mountain. So it's easy to bury it under a mountain. It's easy to hide. In contrast, a nuclear facility like a power plant does require major ventilation and has a huge signature, and so it's very easy to detect and very difficult to hide. This is an interesting slide because it shows that in constructing and maintaining their current capabilities, Iran was very aware of the fact that the timeline to the bomb was something that was an essential component of the negotiations, right? And this particular slide was up on their website for a couple of days, and then they took it down. In fact, the entire website went away. My suspicion, I actually have no idea, is that this was sort of engineers' solution to the idea of no, we are in compliance with our obligations, but diplomatically it doesn't make a lot of sense to admit that they're actually calculating how long it would take them to make a bomb. But it does show the awareness of the importance of both the idea that they are thinking in these terms, but it also, I think, goes to this idea of ensuring that Iran's legal position under the IAEA statute and international law are as strong as they could possibly be. And I think this is an important element of their strategy that gets overlooked. Because even in the case of the US invasion of Iraq, the US did go to the UN and argue that they should be entitled to use military force. And so using that as a piece of the strategy is something that often gets excluded from the realist discourse. But when you open up the ontology in order to you sort of return to a classic realist ontology, you start to see how all of these things can work effectively together, all in pursuit of deterrence. And finally, transforming existing threats into opportunity. So this I'm going to spend a little bit of time on because I think it goes to this narrative of what was it that was going on during this time. There are two narratives that underpin different interpretations of how the US should react to Iranian, what are essentially provocations. And the texts that are typically used are ones that are very favorable to the US interpretation of Iran's desire to pursue a nuclear weapon. But there is this other story that gets told, essentially that the behavior of the Bush administration is part of what is motivating Iranian behavior, and that the US invasion of Afghanistan and then subsequently of Iraq created the fear that the US reportedly would reach Baghdad and then continue on to Tehran. And the Bush administration's naming of the axis of evil in the 2002 State of the Union address is part of this march towards war. Also, the idea that somebody leaked information to this opposition group that then becomes public during that time. So Iran's cheating, so therefore we have a rationale for going in. The EU works very hard to deal with this problem diplomatically and spends many years in negotiations with Iran that the US refuses to join. And Iran, importantly, hasn't had diplomatic relationship with the US since the Iranian Revolution, but now has a lot of interest in having a seat at the table in terms of what's going to happen in this reshaping of the Middle East with the US presence there. So makes a major diplomatic overture, and the existence of this overture is disputed, but there's lots of evidence that it did occur through the Swiss ambassador saying that they did want to strike some sort of grand bargain and be part of this process. And the Bush administration doesn't respond. It's not until 2009 that the US actually sits down with Iranian officials face to face. In 2006, I think it is, someone from the Bush administration does a drive-by. They kind of like show up and walk through the room. But this is the first sort of official point at which the US has already become part of the EU3+3 or the P5+1, depending on how you want to label the group. And then from this point forward, there's still a lot of talk about whether or not there will be strikes against the Iranian nuclear facilities. But arguably, they've gone from taking what they considered to be a major threat and turning it into an opportunity in order to establish diplomatic relations with a country that refused to sit down and talk with them for decades. And the other piece of this argument is just how the US military perceives this. So if I want to argue that Iran has created a sort of effective deterrent relationship with the US, then there's also the piece of how the US takes this up. There's a couple things that are significant about this narrative. I mean, one, the US wasn't talking much about its own plans and capabilities. There was this shift, this question of whether or not Israel would attack. In the background of this conversation is whether or not the US would do so, but the US was sort of, US and General Dempsey in particular were very sort of tight-lipped about that. I mean, they were indicating at this time that they did have the capability to take out also the deeply buried and hardened targets beneath Fordow. However, that required drilling a hole by repeatedly flying aircraft over the top of Fordow and dropping a massive ordnance penetrator into the same conventional weapon, into the same hole over and over again to essentially drill down into the earth. And the chances of the US military being able to do that without taking any casualties were very low, right? It's not the kind of operation that the Israelis did, for instance, when they took out the Iraqi reactor, where they could kind of just buzz in and buzz out, and it was very hard to be detected. So the reason I play that is I do think that there's explicit awareness about these deterrence dynamics. There's explicit awareness about them being mutual in various regards, even though that doesn't become part of the public discourse. In the argument, I think it is very much something that's going on in the conversations of General Dempsey giving his best military advice to the president, which also is importantly linked to the idea that military strikes are not going to end the Iranian program. It's only going to set it back, right? So he talks about that with respect to the Israelis, but elsewhere, there's also the point made that we aren't going to destroy all of their human capital. No matter what, military strikes are not going to solve the Iranian problem, right? It's not going to happen through violence alone. And this was one of the themes that came up a lot from the US military, which is in part based on other aspects. There is a larger strategic picture, but it's an important point that I think that the idea that holding on to the future capability is something that very much is affecting present calculus. So the idea behind this is by returning to a classical realist ontology of power, one that sees power as an end, not a means, you actually open up the possibility of talking about a much wider range of sites and fora for the exercise of great power politics in pursuit of that end, that gets obscured unnecessarily by what I would argue is a normative moment in Waltz's work, where the notion that power can be reduced and measured in terms of its elements is actually also a normative endorsement of nuclear weapons as the ultimate end in terms of power. So by returning to this classical realist ontology, you actually open up a much wider lens through which to view something like the Iranian nuclear strategy, and something like recess deterrence no longer looks quite as ridiculous, right? To propose this to a realist like Matt Koenig, who thinks that nuclear superiority is what creates crisis dominance, is a preposterous, this is an absolutely preposterous argument in the US. And I think that part of that is because the underlying ontology with which all of the theoretical interventions operate preclude this as being something to be considered as realistic. Morgenthau, however, I would say, maybe was overly pessimistic, right? Partly because he has no way of seeing or predicting the kinds of structures that might come into being over time, and the ways in which organizations internationally will develop and thicken. He also has no way of anticipating the kind and degree of surveillance that will develop throughout the Cold War, right? There's the infrastructure, for instance, through the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty Organization that allows states to, it's a web that surrounds the entire globe that picks up data about earthquakes and radionuclide particles in the air. That kind of network didn't exist, right? So there's all sorts of socio-technical shifts that have occurred since then, which I think allow us to go back and reconsider his pessimism in a new light. So that's all I have for you, and I look forward to hearing your comments.
Okay. Great.
Thanks, Sam. That was really interesting. I want to address something that I think is not directly in your paper, but I think links your paper to a bunch of other stuff that we've talked about, and also links, I think, to something that we haven't talked about much in this whole network, although it's always there. And this whole question of modernity, right? And I was really intrigued by your thing on Waltz, because there's a really good piece about to come out, if you haven't seen it, in International Security by Daniel Bessner and Nicolas Guillot, called How Realism Waltzed Away. And it's about the values that drive Waltz's vision of international politics. It's about it as a political project, right? And the whole idea, at least, and I agree with this, is that basically what Waltz is trying to do by reifying power is make modernity safe for democracy. Right? So that the underlying skepticism here is that modernity means mass politics. Mass politics are irrational. Therefore, modernity is intrinsically dangerous, right? And Waltz sees this very clearly in classical realism, right? In their pessimism, in the fact, the idea that somehow nuclear weapons have created this existential change. I mean, Columba earlier called it an unprecedented condition, right? That somehow the world is now profoundly different. Dan picks this up, I think, in the paper of his that we're going to talk about tomorrow morning, that the world is somehow profoundly different. Waltz, I think, argues not so, right? Nuclear weapons aren't profoundly different. They are simply another political fact, like any political fact. And since they are facts, they can be calculated. And since democracies, Waltz explicitly argues, are just as good at calculating their security as any other kind of regime, the whole crisis of modernity simply doesn't exist for him, right? There is no crisis. So Hartmut's whole formulation of the project, right? Modernity, crisis, and realism. Waltz's answer to that is, crisis, what crisis? There is no crisis of modernity, right? Classical realism is just wrong on this. And I think there's something really interesting for us that I would like, at least for us, to talk about. And I think your paper opens it up in a different way that connects it to Waltz and to realism more broadly. Is it true that there is a profound nuclear transformation? If so, what does that transformation consist in? Right? What literally do we think it does? if there's a nuclear condition. Because it becomes really important in what you're talking about here, I think, right? In which Waltz's argument is, don't worry about it, right? Don't be strategically stupid, but don't panic effectively, right? So I just want to throw this out more broadly for everybody. What is the nature of this supposed transformation, and what are its supposed effects, to use your language, right? What do we think it's done to the world, and why? And of sort of not really question to you, but kind of links to everybody.
Mm-hmm.
I'll turn off now and be very careful with this, our last one.
Can I answer that, or Sean, do you want to
Yeah.
follow on?
Do I get a magic sticker? Did this work?
Yeah.
I know.
Very good.
There you go.
Well, just to pick up on that, this is something I was raising 9 years ago, waltzing away with realism. But in terms of simulacrum, how realism was a simulacrum in the work of waltz, purpose simulation. Also, it's problematic in terms of then loses its engagement with the real, which is the whole purpose of realism, is to be able to engage with reality. But Waltz makes a virtue of the fact that he doesn't engage with reality. That's the big epistemology will break. The only thing I would say in relation to your paper, it kind of struck me when I looked at the references and I listened to you talk, is that your reading of Morgenthau is very similar to that of Waltz. You're kind of over-indebted to Waltz's reading of Morgenthau in the sense that you're in common with a lot of people who are reading Morgenthau on, for example, the balance of power. You're looking at the first section of how he works, which is how Waltz understands Morgenthau's understanding of the balance of power, but you're not getting to the second section of Morgenthau's work on the balance of power, where he comes to the conclusion that the balance of power is unreal, unreliable, and is itself an ideological product of liberalism. Right, that is imported from mechanics in the 18th century and becomes sort of habituated into ways of thinking about international relations. And he's actually identifying the balance of power as a huge problem that needs to be investigated critically. But that's not how Waltz understands. Waltz understands very much in mechanistic terms. But the way that we're talking about Morgenthau's understanding of the balance of power is set and established for us by Waltz. The problem with the American School of Realism is that it hasn't really confronted this problem of Waltz's domination of the concept of balance of power, and how there is a much wider understanding of the balance of power, a much more critical balance of power in the works of Morgenthau, but also people like Martin White, as well, who's an obviously contemporary figure, very interested in Ernst Haas as well, yeah, about how things emerge. So we're still, if you like, caught in the web of Waltz, because we're letting him determine how we understand the balance of power. So it may be a very important intervention we could make to identify that there is a fissure here that needs to be examined, and classical realism will bring you in a very different direction vis-a-vis the balance of power than you will get from Waltz. So I think the only thing I would say is maybe examine more critically what constitutes the balance of power in classical realism vis-a-vis neorealism. The other thing I thought I was missing, or not so much missing, but again, it's the debt we owe to Waltz that we need to think about repudiating, is the idea of power itself. Because power for Morgenthau, there's two elements I'd like to stress that we can think about differentiating classical realism from neorealism, and that's one, power isn't the end in itself for Morgenthau. Interest, the achievement of interest is the key to unlocking political activity. And power takes many facets and forms, but its purpose or its function is to serve in the achievement of the end, which is the achievement of interest. I think we've lost sight of that almost completely. And then there's another reaction I'd like to offer, which is that, again, we're caught in this idea of a sort of Morgenthau as John the Baptist to Waltz as Jesus, right? And we tend to take Waltz at his word here that there's something wrong with Morgenthau and that he rectifies it. And the problem with that thinking is that we lack insight into the second half of Morgenthau's idea about power. And so we all know about the animus dominanda in Morgenthau's work, but very few of us have plowed through Politics and Nations to the extent where we read the absolutely crucial sentence where he says there is a force of equally universal nature to the animus dominanda, which is the civilization impulse. And we have to see the animus dominanda in terms of its relationship to this equally universal counterforce that it brings forth. And that brings us into whole new social relationships that are possible that we don't get if we just accept the idea that classical realism in a Morgenthau sense is defined by the animus dominanda. So if I like, it's a great setup to have neorealism versus classical realism. Well, I think we have to take classical realism on its terms, not the terms that are bequeathed to us by technologies.
Okay.
That's just a kind of, it's more of a provocation than a question as such.
Mm-hmm. I'm sort of in receive mode.
Okay.
So I think these are excellent points. And one of the things that I struggle with a little bit is that if the paper is designed to intervene in a certain type of debate about the ongoing struggle with Iran, that debate has various sites where it takes place. One is within think tanks and more of a policy community that it takes a very different shape than the debate that is located within the American Academy. But that American Academy debate is very much dominated by a Waltzian sensibility. And so when you're putting your finger on this problem of accepting too much of the Waltzian look, I think that you're right. But there's a reason for it. It's because you at some point have to, if you want to participate in a certain kind of discourse, on some level you have to choose your battles and choose where to push. Although I don't know that I'm pushing most effectively, and perhaps some of your other suggestions about a deeper reading of Morgenthau would be helpful, because that's kind of missing from the paper in some respect.
More avenues for you.
Yeah.
In terms of the social relationship between America and Iran, if you see it solely in terms of animus dominandi, or if you see it in terms of animus dominandi plus its civilization impulse, different avenues become available in terms of that relationship.
Yeah.
Simple kind of agonistic stroke antagonistic relationship between the two.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, Richard, who's next?
Yeah, I've got two sort of questions for you. One is in terms of the paper, what I'm not understanding, and maybe I'm just not seeing clearly, but going back to sort of the cloud on the mountain, the unsubstantiated vision, I think here a discussion around Campbell as well, in terms of getting from A to B. That you speak in the paper about the need for there to be observable realities of nuclear disarmament, for, in a sense, the clouds to begin to dissipate. Mm-hmm. In what way is your reading of recess deterrence and diplomacy of violence in the context of Iran's negotiations for renewed world diplomatic status through the choice of weaponization of nuclear weapons or not, and they played that clearly very cleverly, as you argue. In what way is this helping us to understand and acquire more observation of realities that can take us to a nuclear-free world? I'm not getting it at all. And my second question is, and we've discussed it a little, but I'm going to put that to one side just for public discussion. Arendt was there in VT. Arendt is not here today. How would you wish to bring Arendt back in within this problematic of the distinction between power and violence, when you seem to be actually looking at an example of diplomacy of violence, and yet your end is a non-violent or a non-nuclear violent world? I'm getting very confused. Can you clarify both things for me?
Yeah, so the first question about how is this a vision of disarmament, I think I maybe wasn't clear enough, or at least I'm assuming kind of prior knowledge about when I was talking about the distinction between a world free of nuclear weapons as a kind of movement and the Nuclear Security Project and the Four Horsemen. Their vision of nuclear disarmament is very much one in which you move to a world which foregrounds deterrence by denial, you recess your arsenals, and you police the globe through surveillance. And they want this to be done on the basis of state-based intelligence, which has always been controversial in the context of multilateral institutions. It's not at all it is the most conservative disarmament position that you can possibly take. It very much, I think, is one of the reasons that you have all of these old Cold Warriors. Like, an old Cold Warrior is not going to create a vision of disarmament organized around emancipation. This is not emancipatory. It's actually rather terrifying in many ways. But even that is considered completely and totally ridiculous and unattainable by most people in the American security establishment. That because anything short of having a secure second strike capability is considered it's just not you can't make sense of it. So even just arguing that Iran was able, because any state that doesn't have nuclear weapons because they have a security umbrella. And that's the primary reason they haven't developed nuclear weapons. So the interesting thing about Iran is they have no security umbrella, and yet they've managed to stand up to and deter multiple nuclear weapon states. And the entire framework and logic of how this gets explained in the U.S. By American realism, this should not be possible. Or what Iran is doing is not a logical possibility within their framework, which is why eventually this will fail, right? Eventually, Iran will weaponize, or eventually the U.S. or Israel will attack. And what you do in the agreement doesn't really matter that much. And so the reason this is saying, so this is a very incremental and sort of, it's just pushing on a weakness in the framing. That's all it's doing. And it's fairly effective in in the non-proliferation community, right? Because they understand these boundaries and they understand the differences in the vision. You know, there's a sort of pre-existing knowledge about how the discourse is shaped. But if I want to be speaking to this other kind of community, mainly one that is more interested in theory, more interested in critical theory, much more friendly to actually my impulses and the place I'm writing from, then I have to sort of figure out, does this even make sense? And I think your questions really go to that. Do you want to say something about this? Oh. So in terms of where does Arendt fit in this, part of the reason that there isn't a deeper reading of more problematic, or I'm not problematizing Waltz's reading of Morgenthau that much, is that the kind of previously, in an earlier version of this paper, the positive moment in terms of understanding ontologically how you can have a more sort of emancipatory vision of power is a more Arendtian concept. And it is something that was underdeveloped in the previous version, and a number of people here pointed out ways in which that there were major things that I was failing to address, so much so that I kind of decided that I wasn't ready for showtime. Because the more I got into it and the more I pulled away at it, the more I realized like how deep the water was, and but I think that the answer is something along the lines of if I'm going to do something more than intervene in this debate about realism, that is going to look something like a much deeper exposition of the distinction between power and violence. It's going to include taking pretty seriously Arendt's notions of the failure of thinking about social and political problems through lenses of causality, and letting go of an idea of power as something that is sort of a push from the past in this causal sense, and theorizing it, building on some of what Pachin Markel in particular is writing about Arendt, but as this sort of pull from the future. Power as being this thing that brings you forward into something that didn't exist before. And in that sense, that would be much more about the kind of what these negotiations look like, how they're formulated. The sort of Arendt writes about power as being something that brings into being a space of appearance. So the question is, so the power of nuclear weapons for Arendt would on this reading be very closely linked to their ability to bring into existence precisely the space of appearance in which these negotiations are taking place. So that would be the direction of the sort of partner paper that would go with this. And basically what I came to the conclusion was I had been trying to put that all in one paper, and it kept failing. I mean, like, you know, pretty much like a belly flop. So I decided I had to pull those two things apart and try to take them each on their own terms, in a sense.
And these negotiations you're talking about Iran and P5+1.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
I suppose with the comprehensive agreement in July last year, you've got a timeline now that you didn't have previously.
Yeah, exactly. Actually, the fact of the conclusion of the agreement is something that this reading would predict. As, maybe I shouldn't say predict, but it's a possibility that means that this space of appearance is going to continue to exist, at least for the next 15 years. So.
Thank you.
Okay. Daniel.
Yeah. George, shall I wait for the match to say?
Yeah.
Don't throw it.
Don't throw it. Don't drop it.
Yeah, I think that's
Don't sit on it.
I think that sounds exactly right to me. You know, the aren't bit, and you know, maybe the way to think about it, the contrast. I don't know. So and this is, you know, I'm going to preface this by saying I stopped studying security studies properly in sort of 2002, and so everything I talk about when I talk about security studies has this sort of vaguely 90s quality to it, and I'm about to do that again. But compare what we got with P5+1 to like the fissile materials scholarship thing I talked about, right? And U.S.-led, right? The Israelis were kind of into it, and it was like, how are we going to be able to sort of create these stockpiles for nuclear weapons? But we're not going to really say who has what, and we're going to leave this space. The Israelis didn't want to say what they had and what they didn't have. Well, everybody will be able to keep this pile of fissile materials, but we won't say any, you know. And in some sense, what Iran's got on its own terms is not actually altogether, and all the people who were in favor of Israel, of the FNCC, they looked at the Iran agreement and they're like, yeah, it's better than what we had now. Right. It's only Bibi and the fear mongers that are sort of
Right.
like, no, this is Mossad, part 7, right? But like, you know, the head of Mossad is like, yeah, okay. You know, right? And so what's the difference? The difference is that the way that P5 is framed, it's not the Americans bringing the end of history and the framing and the ontological baggage of our victory in the Cold War,
Right.
right? But rather that we've convened as basically as our own terms.
Yeah.
And you must effing recognize.
Yeah.
You know? And that strikes me as that strikes me as very much something that Arnold would say.
That's a really interesting comparison. I like that comparison a lot, actually.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't write that, you know, because I stopped rolling it something years ago, right? But that strikes me as exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm sorry, I don't know your name.
Yeah.
Hannah, okay. There.
I have a question about the revolutionary knowledge you talked about. And I think it was really interesting, but I would like to ask, where does this revolutionary knowledge come from? Or where does the revolutionary potential of knowledge we talk about come unlocked? Because we talked about the different places with the different narratives, so think tanks, academia, policy, civil society. So who unlocked the revolutionary potential, and how do they convince the other things?
That's a good question. So part of this is just it's still part of this kind of post-Cold War moment where it has become where the contours of the national security state, particularly around the weapons labs and so forth, that's just shifted, right? And also just the passage of time means that now there are things that can be FOIA or Freedom of Information Act requests. There are things that can be requested that couldn't be requested before. So part of this is just simply the passage of time and the fact that there are historians who now are very excited about the fact that they can write and think about things that it wasn't possible before. And part of it has to do with the fact that I think that there'll probably be some closing again, but there was a post-Cold War moment where just some of the intimidation around doing the poking around sort of eased. So when I'm talking about the revolutionary potential, I do think that in the US there was very, very careful policing of boundaries around the practices of producing and maintaining arsenals that just have loosened. That energy has sort of been directed other places. You know, the nuclear capabilities are no longer seen as the tip of the spear. You know, the tip of the spear in U.S. national security state is NSA and Special Operations Forces. And the nuclear enterprise is old news. It's the least prestigious thing to do within the U.S. military. And it's one of the reasons why there's so many morale problems and motivational issues with the missileers. It's still cool to fly a bomber, but it used to be cool because that's what dropped nuclear weapons. Now it's cool because that's what bombs Saddam's palace and is the sort of official opening of the Iraq War. So I would say that a lot of it is more historically contingent. In terms of the relationship between these communities, it is interesting to sort of watch how the access to historical information does kind of reshape various debates, and the historians, I think, in important ways also are participating now in this bridge between think tanks and academia, because think tanks tend to be much more about what you know rather than how you know it. And in academia, they're much more interested in how you know what, and historians do a little bit of both. And so there's but I sort of, this is a hook that I'm hanging it on, and I don't want it to be too distracting. So if it is too distracting, I will just take the hook out. Like if it doesn't fit, that hook can go away. There's any number of hooks that this can be hung on. It's a good question.
Casper.
this is a crucial question, and when I read this and I reread it again this morning on the focus, it strikes me that one of the things that are not explicitly here has to do with what is it in the nuclear condition that, or at least I would say part of investigating the nuclear condition is also understanding how human beings or policy people manage to live with and talk about nuclear weapons in a particular way that prevents them from asking some questions and enable them to ask other questions. And this is why I really like the ambition of your paper, which is particularly to connect these stories we tell, the nuclear histories that are available, with a specific case which doesn't make any sense if you if you buy the conventional story, this doesn't make any sense.
Right.
So I think this should be part of the ambition of the special issue academic workshop. I think this is what Columba is also getting at with his questions about imminent critique, and I'm also saying it partly in a self-serving manner because it's also what I think we're trying to do. So what is obscure, what's not obscure in the nuclear condition, and it goes right to Michael's question, crisis, what crisis. I think that should be much more explicitly stated in the ambition, and perhaps would make it easier for Anne to make the argument here that this is what the Iran case can show us. Iran doesn't make sense in that framework.
Right.
It's an excellent point.
Yeah. It's,
And it really allows you to fit it.
Patrick?
One question. I'm wondering, you say in the paper that El-Baradei did not find evidence of the existence of a nuclear weapons program, and that would have triggered a referral to the UN Security Council. I'm wondering why didn't El-Baradei refer Iran to the UN Security Council? How much discretion did he and the IAEA have in the matter? And I think that there's a case that they had that some alternate future or someone other than El-Baradei might have gone down that road. And then does that imply the IAEA is a participant in these deterrence negotiations in this framework you structured?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And probably you can answer it better than I can, but I will take a risk and answer it maybe in a different way than you would. So yes, I would say that one of the interesting things about this idea that the space of appearance comes into being, and it's governed by both the notion that there are some sort of array of instruments of violence that then become political objects in important ways. That the negotiations then take place within this. When I use the word technopolitical frame, my meaning of that is this idea that there is a objective truth that governs the boundaries of the political conversation and what is or isn't allowed to be considered within that rubric, right? So all of the negotiations that are taking place with Iran are happening in this interplay between the group of experts who are discussing what can be verified, what can't be verified. Should we negotiate about the number of centrifuges, or should we use a measurement of separative work units, which is actually what physicists prefer? And then they're getting feedback from the political level, because actually separative work units would have very much favored an Iranian interpretation of how the outcome should be. It would have been an advantage for them, and so that even though it's less precise, they still went with a number of centrifuges, right? There's this constant interplay between the scientific and technical level, and because the agreement is actually written in terms of literally how many centrifuges can you have where doing what, the politics is then governed by the interpretive space that you can win within that objective framework. So El Barde going in and verifying is playing this role of objective observer, which is then saying that's on the table, that's off the table. He's kind of like the referee. Our referee is political, yes, but his role is bounded. And does it matter if you have a friendly referee who's from your home? You know, are you playing at home? Are you playing away? Yes, it matters. But it doesn't give sort of indefinite amounts of freedom. I do personally think, and this is like a hobby horse of mine, that I think that the move from the idea of material balance zones, that the IAE goes in and verifies what comes in and out in terms of physical materials, and basically IAEA inspectors are accountants to the state level approach where they're supposed to be investigators, does horrible damage to the idea of objectivity that underlies the IAEA, because they've let go of, on an epistemological level, their claim to complete objectivity, right? Like, I think it was the state level approach was one of these non-proliferation initiatives that the entire non-proliferation community loves. I think what it does is, in order to actually have the IAEA do its job properly, you basically have to invade a country and check every nook and cranny now in order for them to actually have verified this idea you can verify the absence of nuclear weapons. I think it will, over time, erode the effectiveness of the IAEA system, because I think people underappreciate the role of objectivity in bounding the space, the work that the space of appearance does.
Certainly raises expectations of the LOD.
Yeah, I think it creates it gives, it makes their determinations inherently more political. Right? Like, the idea that what they are saying is more political if they are using a state level approach, because the epistemological problem has no answer except in how it gets worked out in practice. And that practice then becomes, I think, overly politicized. And, Amano is incredibly defensive about these things. I asked him at ISA when he came and spoke one year, a question about how he deals with this epistemological problem. And his response was, I have been fair to Iran. And I was like, whoa, that is not what I asked. I had no idea what happened. But no, it's an excellent question.
It's a paper in itself.
Yeah. So we're 5 over now. We should stop.
We need to move on.
Okay. Can you ask your question? Okay, great. All right, thank you.